6-year-old Sophie Miller had never known a night like this. It was meant to be just another weekend with her father, another quiet evening that she would soon forget. But tonight, everything was different. Her trembling fingers, small and unsure, had dialed the emergency number, shattering the silence of a cold Portland evening. The voice that broke through the static of the 911 line was fragile and raw, barely a whisper. "My belly hurts. Daddy made me drink something. Please help me." In that moment, the dispatcher's pen froze. That voice, a child's voice, so full of pain and desperation, pulled everyone in the room to attention. They didn't know it yet, but this would be the start of a race against time, a race that would uncover a terrible secret and reveal the unshakable bond between a little girl and a dog that refused to let her go unheard. The operator's response was swift. She traced the number, dispatched the nearest unit. That unit was Officer Daniel Harris. At 38, Daniel had the kind of weathered resilience only life could carve into someone. His brown hair was cropped neatly, his square jaw covered by a trimmed beard, and his eyes gray with a touch of steel, spoke of experiences that had left their mark. A combat veteran, Daniel had seen the worst of humanity, and though the war had ended for him overseas, the battle still raged in his heart. His marriage had crumbled, his nights were restless. But the Portland Police Department became his second chance, a place to fight a different kind of battle, where the enemies were not foreign, but local. And then there was Rex. Rex, his 7-year-old German Shepherd partner, stood in the passenger seat of the patrol car, sensing the urgency before Daniel even hit the gas. Rex wasn't just a dog. He was a soldier in his own right, forged by years of service and scarred by the battles he'd faced his side, marked by a knife, his paw by broken glass. But none of it mattered, because Rex's loyalty to Daniel was unbreakable. The two had fought side by side in war and peace, through quiet nights and desperate hours. As Daniel flipped on the sirens, his eyes flicked to Rex. The dog's body was taut with focus, his amber eyes gleaming with determination. The lights flashed, and the car sped toward the address, a modest 2-story house at the end of Maplewood Street. Porch lights flickered feebly in the misty Oregon night. The smell of wet leaves hung in the air as Daniel parked the patrol car, his heart racing. He knocked once, firmly. The door creaked open, and there she was, Sophie. She stood in the doorway, small and fragile, with blonde hair tied in uneven pigtails. Her face was streaked with tears, and her wide green eyes shimmered, shocked, scared, and full of a child's innocent trust. Her hands shook, and as she looked up at Daniel, she clutched the stuffed bear tightly to her chest. Rex stepped forward, his large frame casting a protective shadow over her. This story is a reminder that miracles still happen, even in the darkest moments. And sometimes, the bond between a child and a dog is the only thing that stands between life and death. She wore a wrinkled pink nightgown dotted with faded stars, clutching against her chest, a battered stuffed cat whose fur was nearly rubbed off. She swayed slightly barefoot, her small body, trembling not only from the cold draft behind her, but from something deeper. Daniel's heart sank as he glanced down at Rex, who stood silent but steadfast, eyes locked onto Sophie with a calming presence. Stay with us until the end, because this isn't just a story of a child in danger. It's about a little girl's courage, a dog's loyalty, and an officer's promise to protect, no matter the cost. In that moment, something inside Daniel shifted. This wasn't just a call to him, it was a mission. But as they would soon discover, the danger they were about to face was far greater than they had ever imagined. The father Sophie had trusted was not who he appeared to be, and what Rex had already sensed, what he had been silently warning them about, would soon unfold in a way that no one expected. As the story reached its darkest hour, with Sophie's father standing ready to strike again, Rex made a choice, one that would turn the tide of fate. In a desperate act of courage, the dog would not only save Sophie, but also reveal a secret so chilling it would shake their world to its core. This story is a reminder that miracles still happen, even in the darkest moments. And sometimes, the bond between a child and a dog is the only thing that stands between life and death. She wore a wrinkled pink nightgown dotted with faded stars, clutching against her chest, a battered stuffed cat whose fur was nearly rubbed off. She swayed slightly barefoot, her small body, trembling not only from the cold draft behind her, but from something deeper. In that moment, something inside Daniel shifted. This wasn't just a call to him, it was a mission. But as they would soon discover, the danger they were about to face was far greater than they had ever imagined. The father Sophie had trusted was not who he appeared to be. And what Rex had already sensed, what he had been silently warning them about, would soon unfold in a way that no one expected. Sophie's lips pressed together, her gaze darted to the dark living room, then back to Daniel. He left. He said not to tell Mommy. Daniel's jaw tightened. He lifted his live radio to inform dispatch, then knelt again. We're going to take care of you. Okay, you're safe now, Rex nudged. Sophie's hand gently, and the girl buried her small fingers into his thick fur as though holding on to life itself. Daniel scooped her up, feeling how light she was, how her tiny frame shook against his uniform. Sophie did not resist. She clung to him desperately, the stuffed cat crushed between them. As he carried her outside, the cold night air hit them both. The patrol car's lights painted the mist red and blue. Daniel opened the back seat, placing Sophie carefully on the bench. Rex jumped in beside her without needing a command, curling his large body protectively around the child. Sophie leaned against Rex, her head resting on his shoulder. He knocked once, firmly. The door creaked open. It was filled with the unsaid, the fear in Sophie's eyes, the questions twisting in Daniel's mind, the weight of responsibility pressing down on his chest. Finally, Sophie spoke, again, her voice almost a whisper. Will Mommy be mad? Daniel glanced back. Why would she be mad? Because Sophie paused, her grip on Rex tightening. Because I drank the drink Daddy gave me. It hurt. Daniel's knuckles widened on the steering wheel. He chose his words carefully. Your mommy loves you very much. She'll just be glad you're safe. Rex gave a low rumble, pressing his nose against Sophie's arm. She smiled weakly and whispered something Daniel almost didn't hear. He listens better than people do. Daniel exhaled slowly. The truth was, she was right. Sometimes dogs saw what people ignored. As the hospital loomed ahead, bright lights against the black sky, Daniel felt the gnawing certainty that this was not just a case of a sick child. Something darker hid in the silence of that Maplewood house. And, if Sophie's trembling words were true, it was Rex, faithful, unyielding Rex, who might lead them to uncover what had really happened during that terrible weekend. The patrol car pulled into the emergency entrance. Nurses rushed forward as Daniel carried Sophie inside, Rex trotting close behind. And though the hospital doors slid shut behind them, sealing away the chill of the night, Daniel knew the real storm was only just beginning. The hospital's fluorescent lights cast long shadows across the white-tiled floor, humming softly with the rhythm of machines and muted footsteps. The emergency ward was never truly quiet, but tonight, the air felt especially heavy. A child had arrived under circumstances that raised more questions than answers, and the truth lay hidden behind her pale cheeks and trembling hands. Sophie Miller lay, curled up in a hospital bed, too big for her tiny frame. Electrodes traced her heartbeat, beeping steadily. A nurse had draped a blanket decorated with cartoon animals over her, though the little girl still clutched her battered, stuffed cat tightly against her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored. Her eyelids fluttered but did not close completely, as if sleep itself had become a dangerous place. By her side, Officer Daniel Harris remained seated, his uniform slightly rumpled from the long night. His rugged features, square jaw, and tired gray eyes betrayed a man who had long since grown used to both waiting rooms and war zones. Yet, something about watching Sophie breathe so shallowly cut deeper than any battlefield memory. He reached out once, steadying the stuffed cat when it slipped from her grasp, then sat back again, jaw tight. Rex, the German shepherd, rested at the foot of the bed. His body was a shield of fur and muscle, tan and black coat gleaming under the sterile light. Every time Sophie stirred, Rex's ears flicked and his amber eyes snapped open, as though promising silently that no harm would come near her again. Nurses passed by, cautiously, offering small smiles, but none dared ask the dog to move. He seemed as much a patient's guardian as any human could be. It was then that the door burst open with a gasp of hurried footsteps. Laura Miller arrived. Laura was in her mid-30s, tall and slender, with chestnut brown hair that fell in waves over her shoulders. Tonight, strands were disheveled from travel, hastily tied back into a knot that did little to contain the chaos of the past hours. Her skin, usually a warm ivory glow, looked pale from exhaustion. A fitted navy blazer hung off her shoulders, wrinkled from the drive down. From Seattle, there was an air of elegance to her, cheekbones defined, lips full, but her eyes, hazel and rimmed red from tears and sleeplessness, gave her away. She rushed to the bedside, dropping her travel bag carelessly onto a chair. "Sophie," she breathed, brushing hair from her daughter's forehead. "Oh, sweetheart." Sophie stirred, murmuring something incoherent. Her small hands sought Rex first, fingers brushing his fur before, slipping into her mother's trembling palm. Laura glanced at the officer in the room. "What happened?" Her voice cracked, but beneath the break was steel. Laura Miller was not the kind of woman to shy away from confrontation. Colleagues often described her as sharp, dependable, the type who shouldered responsibilities without complaint. But, at that moment, Daniel saw only a mother undone. Daniel stood, his tall frame, casting a protective shadow. "I'm Officer Harris," he said evenly. "This is Rex. We responded to a 911 call made by your daughter. She said she wasn't feeling well and mentioned her father gave her something to drink. She's stable for now, but the doctors are running tests." Laura's eyes widened, then narrowed. "Mark?" Daniel nodded once. "Is he her father?" "Yes," Laura exhaled, her voice laced with disbelief. "Mark Miller, my ex-husband." At that moment, the door opened again, and Dr. Catherine Lewis stepped inside. Catherine was a woman in her early 42s, average height, her figure trim, and her presence quietly commanding. She wore a white coat over, pale scrubs, her dark hair pulled back into a low bun, straighting, aged. Her almond-shaped eyes, brown and steady, were eyes that had seen too much, suffering, but still carried compassion. She smiled faintly, though the corners of her mouth never quite lifted enough to ease the tension. "Mrs. Miller?" she asked gently. Laura nodded, standing protectively beside Sophie. "I'm Dr. Lewis. I've been examining your daughter." She lowered her voice as she approached. "The initial results show traces of a sedative in her system. It's not something a child should ever have ingested." Laura's hand flew to her mouth. "Sedative?" Dr. Lewis gave a grave nod. "We're keeping her under observation. She's responding, but this isn't accidental. The dosage is small, but intentional." Daniel's jaw flexed. His gaze fell briefly to Rex, who had risen to his paws, sensing the shift in tension. Laura steadied herself, her voice rising. "I left Sophie with Mark because I had no choice. I had to travel for work Seattle, 2 nights, I thought. I thought one weekend with her father couldn't hurt." She shook her head, tears forming again. "I trusted him. I thought it was safe." Daniel studied her carefully. "When was the divorce finalized?" 6 months ago, Laura said. Her tone carried both weariness and lingering bitterness. "Mark wasn't reliable even before that, but the court granted him visitation rights," I argued, "but they called me overprotective. They thought a father deserved his weekends." She looked back at Sophie, stroking her hair. "Now look." Dr. Lewis placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "She's strong. Children are resilient, but we need to know exactly what happened." Daniel folded his arms, expression dark. "Do you know if Mark associates with anyone?" "Questionable." Laura hesitated, biting her lip. "Since the separation, he's been spending time with new friends. I don't know them well. Men who drink too much, women who come and go. He posts photos sometimes at bars, parties," I warned the judge. But she trailed off, shaking her head. Daniel made a note in his small leather-bound notebook. His handwriting was sharp and efficient, a reflection of the man himself. "We'll look into that, but there's something else." He glanced toward Rex, who was circling near the small pile of Sophie's belongings stacked in the corner of the room. Her little pink backpack, a folded blanket, and a pair of shoes still clean. Too clean for a weekend that was supposed to have been spent camping. Rex sniffed, tail stiff, then pawed insistently at the backpack. A low whine escaped his throat. Daniel crouched, unzipping the bag. Inside were Sophie's pajamas, neatly folded, and a small plastic water bottle with a faint chemical smell. He held it up carefully, glancing at Dr. Lewis. "We'll need to test this," she said immediately, calling a nurse to take it. Rex sniffed again, this time circling the folded blanket, his nose pressed against the fabric. Then he barked once, short and sharp. Sophie stirred at the sound, her small voice breaking the tension. "That's the one. The blanket Daddy gave me. It smelled funny." Laura's eyes widened, tears spilling freely now. She pulled Sophie close, though careful not to disturb the IV line in her arm. "Oh, baby." Daniel rose, his face grim. He knew then that this was no accident, no careless mistake. Something deliberate had been done, and Rex had already uncovered the first thread of evidence. As Dr. Lewis stepped out to prepare additional tests, Daniel placed a steadying hand on Laura's arm. We'll find out the truth. But tonight, your daughter is safe. That's what matters." Laura looked up at him, her hazel eyes brimming with pain and determination. "Safe for now," she whispered. In the silence that followed, Rex padded back to Sophie's bedside. He laid his head gently against her legs, eyes watching the door, as if daring anyone to try and harm her again. And though the hospital ward bustled with routine noises, footsteps, monitors, clipped conversations, the truth was clear. The case had just begun, and it was Rex who had already pointed them toward the dark secrets waiting to surface. The hallway outside Sophie's room smelled faintly of disinfectant and the sterile tang of fresh linens. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, spilling white light over polished tiles. Nurses moved briskly with clipboards and carts, their rubber soles squeaking softly against the floor. It was on the surface an ordinary night in Portland General Hospital, yet, to Daniel Harris, the air felt heavier, laden with the weight of things unsaid. Sophie had fallen asleep again, her small chest rising and falling steadily, her stuffed cat tucked against her cheek. Laura Miller sat in a chair, beside the bed, shoulders bowed, her hair undone from hours of pacing and worry. She whispered prayers under her breath, unaware that Daniel, standing near the doorway, caught each one. Rex lay curled at the foot of the bed, but his ears twitched restlessly. His black and tan coat gleamed under the fluorescent light, and every so often he lifted his head to sniff at the pink blanket folded over Sophie's lap. Daniel noticed. He stepped closer, crouching, beside his partner. "What is it, boy?" Rex pressed his nose hard into the blanket, pawing at it with a sharp urgency. Then he let out a low bark, short and clipped. Daniel knew that sound. It was Rex's way of telling him there was something hidden, something wrong. Laura looked up, startled. "What's he doing?" Daniel met her gaze steadily. "He smells something." He lifted the blanket carefully, holding it toward Rex again. The shepherd inhaled deeply, his amber eyes snapping to Daniel's as though insisting. Then, without warning, Rex tugged forward, pulling Daniel by. "The sleeve. Stay with your daughter," Daniel told Laura quickly. "We'll be back." Rex led him out the door and down the hallway, nails clicking against the polished floor. His body moved with tense purpose, his tail stiff, head low, to the ground. Nurses stepped aside as the pair hurried past. The dog's nose guided him like a compass, and Daniel trusted him without question. Through the automatic doors, the night air hit them cold, damp with Portland mist. The hospital parking lot stretched before them, rows of vehicles shining under yellow lamps. Rex went straight toward a dark blue sedan parked crookedly in the visitors section. Daniel's gut tightened. It was Mark Miller's car. The vehicle was ordinary, a mid-2000s Ford sedan with fading paint and a cracked taillight. But to Daniel, it radiated unease. He circled once, then tried the door. Locked. He called it in, and moments later, a uniformed hospital security guard arrived, jangling keys. The guard introduced himself quickly as Tom Alvarez, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a broad frame, softened by middle age. His uniform was neat, though his belt strained slightly at the buckle. He had the demeanor of someone who had seen much and judged little, eyes kind yet cautious. "You, Harris?" Tom asked, handing over the keys. His voice carried the husk of years spent talking over radios. "Dispatch said you needed access." Daniel nodded. "That's the car belongs to the child's father." Tom frowned but unlocked the door. Daniel opened it slowly, flashlight in hand. The smell hit first faint but unmistakable, chemical and bitter, lingering even after the night air rushed inside. On the passenger seat sat a disposable plastic cup, its rim stained with a white film. Daniel lifted it with a gloved hand, nostrils tightening. The residue smelled of medication, something sedating, heavy. Rex climbed onto the back seat, sniffing intently. He pawed at the carpet, then barked again. Daniel crouched and shined his light. There, ground into the fabric, was a faint scattering of white powder. He let out a low whistle. "Got you?" Tom shifted, uneasily. "That doesn't look like juice stains, officer." "No," Daniel agreed, grimly. "It doesn't." He collected the evidence into bags, marking them carefully. This was no longer a vague suspicion. This was tangible. When he returned inside, Laura was on her feet. She had shed her blazer and stood in just a plain white blouse, sleeves rolled up. Worry had carved her beautiful features into sharper edges, but her hazel eyes still burned with fierce resolve. "What did you find?" she demanded. Daniel hesitated only long, enough to ensure Sophie remained asleep. Something in the car, a residue that suggests your daughter wasn't imagining things. Laura's knees nearly gave, and she clutched the edge of the chair for support. I knew it. I told the court he was reckless, but they wouldn't listen. And now, Daniel steadied her with a hand on her arm. Listen to me. We don't jump into conclusions yet, but the evidence is pointing in a direction I don't like. She swallowed, staring at the floor. Mark said he'd take her camping. He even packed her little fishing pole. Why lie? Daniel didn't answer immediately, because in his mind, the lies were stacking higher than the truth. It was then that Sophie stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, still glazed from medication. But when she saw Rex, she reached for a crayon left on the bedside tray. Wordlessly, she pulled the sketch pad Dr. Lewis had provided earlier and began to draw. Laura leaned close. Sweetheart, what are you drawing? Sophie's hand trembled, but she kept working. Slowly, the outline of a house took shape. A large house, not the cabin, in the woods she had been promised. Beside it, she drew a mailbox shaped like a fish, shaded in with thick blue strokes. Dark figures surrounded the house, crude shapes but unsettling in their numbers. Daniel crouched beside her. Sophie, is this where you went with Daddy? The little girl nodded. Her, pigtails falling loose around her face. Her voice was barely a whisper. Not camping. We went there. His friend's house. Big house. Laura's breath caught. Who lives there? I don't know, Sophie murmured. But Daddy said not to tell Mommy. Daniel stared at the drawing. He knew that mailbox. He had seen it before during patrols in the Maplewood suburb. A gaudy, oversized fish mailbox outside a property, too. Polished, too guarded. Victor Hall's house. Victor was a name he'd heard in passing, whispered in police reports that never quite became cases. A man in his 40s, slick with money from uncertain ventures, often surrounded by people who drank too hard and partied too long. The kind of man who smiled wide, but whose eyes never followed. Daniel stood, blood thrumming in his ears. He folded the sketch pad gently, sliding it into a plastic sleeve. Evidence. Laura looked at him, her face pale. What does it mean? Daniel's expression hardened. It means Mark lied. He never took her camping. He took her somewhere far worse. Rex barked once, sharp and certain, as if confirming what Daniel already knew. The trail they were following had just turned darker, and it was leading straight into Maplewood. The next morning carried a gray pall over Portland, the kind of sky that pressed low with rain clouds, as though the heavens themselves were burdened with secrets. Officer Daniel Harris drove in. Silence, his patrol SUV rumbling along the wet asphalt. Beside him, Rex sat, tall, ears prick-ricked, his amber eyes fixed forward with an intensity that betrayed his instinct. They were closing in on something dangerous. The address was clear. Now Maplewood. Sophie's drawing had been unmistakable. A mailbox in the shape of a fish painted bright blue. It wasn't the sort of detail a child invented. Daniel had seen it before on late patrols. The house belonged to Victor Hall, a man who made most officers uneasy, though never enough to nail him with charges. Victor was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that once could have belonged to a model, but had since been sharpened by years of indulgence. His hair was jet black, slicked back with expensive pomade, and his square jaw carried the shadow of a perpetual 5 stubble. Victor dressed in expensive casuals, tailored jeans, leather shoes, silk shirts. But beneath the sheen was arrogance, the kind of confidence that came from money earned through shadows. His name had crossed police desks before, noise complaints, rumors of drug parties, whispers of young women too scared to testify. Nothing had ever stuck. Daniel, he remembered one colleague muttering, Hall's like oil on water. You can't grab him. Now, with Sophie's trembling, drawing, they finally had a thread. The house itself rose from the quiet suburban street like an imposter. Most of the homes in Maplewood were modest trim lawns, white fences, bicycles left on porches. But Victor's house was oversized. Its exterior painted a harsh off-white that seemed sterile rather than welcoming. The curtains were drawn tight, shutting out the gray morning light. A faint bass thumped from within, though it stopped abruptly as the police vehicles pulled up. Rex growled low in his throat. Daniel glanced at his partner. Easy, boy. We'll handle it. 2 additional officers joined him, Sergeant Paul Whitaker and Officer Maria Lopez. Whitaker was in his 52nd, stocky, with a round belly and thinning gray hair. His face was lined, his mustache yellowed at the edges from years of cigarettes. Gruff but dependable, Paul was the type of cop who had seen everything and trusted little. He had a reputation for being blunt, often rubbing superiors the wrong way, but no one doubted his instincts. Lopez, by contrast, was in her late 22s, sharpied and lean with jet black hair tied tightly into a ponytail. She carried herself with a mix of precision and quiet determination. The daughter of immigrants, Maria had worked harder than most to earn her badge, and though younger, she balanced Paul's world-weary skepticism with energy and vigilance. Together, the small team approached the door. Daniel knocked firmly. Portland. Police, Mr. Hall, open up. A pause. Then the door cracked open. Victor Hall leaned casually against the frame, cigarette between his fingers, dressed in a deep burgundy silk shirt unbuttoned. Halfway. A gold chain glinted against his chest. His eyes, icy blue, sharp, and calculating, flicked over the officers, then down to Rex, who bared his teeth silently. "Well," Victor drawled, exhaling smoke. "To what do I owe this early visit?" Daniel's voice was even. "We need to ask you a few questions. Mind if we come in?" Victor smirked, stepping aside with a mocking flourish. "By all means, don't let the lack of coffee stop you." The moment they entered, the stench hit them. Cigarette. Smoke clung to the curtains and carpets, and beneath it was the sharp sting of alcohol, cheap whiskey mixed with expensive cologne. Empty glasses littered the coffee table, and ashtrays overflowed. The living room looked as though a party had only just ended. Half-full bottles of vodka, an overturned cushion, sticky rings on polished wood. A painting of a sailboat hung crooked on the wall, too pristine in a space otherwise cluttered. Whitaker muttered, under his breath, "Classy." Victor sprawled onto a leather sofa, exhaling. Another cloud of smoke. "Ask away, gentleman and lady. I have nothing to hide." But Rex didn't wait for permission. He prowled the room, nose to the floor, ignoring Victor's feigned hospitality. His growls grew sharper as he neared the back hallway. Daniel followed. "Where does this lead?" Victor's smile twitched. "Storage, laundry, nothing exciting." Rex scratched furiously at a door near the kitchen, its handle gleaming as though it had been polished more often than touched. The dog barked loud and insistent, his paws striking the wood with force. Maria stepped forward. "We need to see what's inside." Victor rose smoothly, spreading his hands. "You'll need a warrant for that, unless you plan to break the law in your pursuit of the law." But Whitaker had already noticed something. A faint line of dust disturbed along the floorboards near the door, as though it had been opened often, despite Victor's attempt at secrecy. He locked eyes with Daniel. "Probable cause?" he muttered. Daniel gave a curt nod. "We're opening it?" Victor's jaw tightened, his mask of charm cracking for the first time. The door swung open with a groan. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. The air that drifted upward was stale, thick with the smell of mildew, and something chemical, sharp, metallic wrong. Rex bolted down first, barking furiously. Daniel followed with flashlight drawn, his boots creaking against the steps. Whitaker and Lopez flanked him, weapons ready. The basement revealed itself in beams of light, concrete walls, low ceilings, and a scatter of objects that sent Laura Miller's words echoing back in Daniel's mind. Along one shelf were rows of prescription bottles, sedatives, antipsychotics, pills not prescribed to Victor or anyone else lawfully. Open. Cases of liquor stood stacked in corners half empty, the smell mixing sickly in the stale air. On a long table sat several plastic cups identical to the one from Mark's car, each stained at the rims. Beside them lay empty bottles of soda and juice cover for something far more sinister. And there, discarded on a chair, was a child's pink shoelace. Rex barked wildly, pawing at the ground near the far wall. Daniel moved closer and saw faint scuff marks, tiny shoe prints, pressed into the dusty concrete too small for any adult. Maria swore under her breath. "Kids have been here." Victor's voice floated down from the top of the stairs, calm but tinged with irritation. "You're trespassing. Do you even realize what you're doing to your careers?" Whitaker shouted back. "Save it, Hall. We've seen enough." Daniel crouched, bagging the shoelace, his hands steady, though his jaw clenched. The evidence was here. Evidence Sophie hadn't lied. Evidence Mark had led his daughter into something rotten. Rex pressed his nose to the floor again, then whined softly, circling back toward the stairs. His amber eyes looked to Daniel, filled with urgency. The dog wanted them to move fast. This wasn't just about evidence. It was about stopping something ongoing. When they emerged, Victor's charm had evaporated. His cigarette had burned to the filter, and his jaw worked as though grinding down words he dared not say. Daniel stepped forward, eyes locked on him. "You're coming with us, Hall. You can explain yourself." Sophie sat propped up against the raised bed, the thin hospital blanket pulled to her chin. Her small face was pale, freckles standing out sharply against skin that should have been glowing with childhood. Her long lashes trembled whenever she blinked, as though holding back shadows of memory too heavy for a 6-year-old to bear. Beside her, Rex sprawled, patiently on the polished floor, his great frame curled in protective watch. Every so often, his dark brown eyes lifted toward her, as if silently reminding her she wasn't alone. His steady breathing was a metronome of calm in the otherwise sterile room. Detective Daniel Harris sat across from her, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees. Daniel was a man in his late 30s, broad-shouldered with lines around his eyes that deepened when he frowned. He had the kind of face that people instinctively trusted: square jaw, a trimmed beard showing flecks of gray, and eyes the color of storm clouds. Life had left marks on him, a divorce 3 years earlier that had made him fiercely protective of children caught in fractured homes, and a younger brother lost to an overdose, the pain of which still pushed him to chase every lead with relentless energy. Tonight, however, he kept his voice soft, stripped of authority, as though speaking not as a cop, but as a father, figure Sophie never had. Next to him sat Dr. Emily Carter, a child psychologist the hospital had called in. Emily was in her early 40s, slim, but with the kind of presence that filled a room without effort. She wore her auburn hair tied in a loose bun, a few rebellious strands softening her angular face. Behind her glasses, her hazel eyes held a blend of sharp intelligence and maternal warmth. Her approach with children was gentle, weaving trust through patience. She had built a reputation for helping young trauma victims find words when fear strangled them. Laura Miller hovered by the bed, visibly torn between wanting to gather Sophie in her arms and respecting the careful process Emily had laid out. Laura was in her mid-30s, tall with straight blonde hair that fell past her shoulders in a curtain she often pushed back when nervous. Her business suit, still wrinkled from the late-night drive back from Seattle, hung awkwardly on her, as if it belonged to a different world, a world far removed from the sterile hospital room and the fragile child before her. The makeup she had applied days earlier had faded, revealing dark circles beneath her blue eyes. The normally composed, confident project manager now looked like a woman, crushed under the weight of guilt. Emily crouched slightly so her gaze met Sophie's at eye level. "Sweetheart, you're very brave to talk to us," she said in a tone like velvet. "Can you tell me what happened when you were with your dad this weekend?" Sophie's small hands twisted the hem of her blanket. Her voice was barely audible at first. "Daddy said we were going camping, but we didn't go. He took me to a house. It was big with a box outside shaped like a blue fish." Her eyes darted nervously toward Daniel, as though checking if she was allowed to continue. Daniel nodded, reassuringly. "You're doing just fine, Sophie." Her lips trembled. "There were lots of people there. They laughed loud and the lights were too bright. I cried because I wanted Mommy, then Daddy's friend. She gave me a drink. It was bitter and it made my tummy hurt. She said it would help me sleep." Laura stiffened, clutching the bed rail so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Who gave you that drink, honey?" she whispered, though her throat threatened to close. Sophie hesitated. She looked down at Rex, who had risen and placed his massive head on the side of her bed. His ears flicked forward, and his steady warmth seemed to give her courage. With a shuddering breath, she whispered, "Her name was Samantha. She had red hair. I remember because it shined under the lights." The name hit Laura like a blow. Samantha Hayes, her old college roommate, a woman she had trusted countless times to watch Sophie during late nights at work. Samantha, with her fiery curls and quick wit, who always seemed so dependable. The betrayal lanced through Laura's chest like ice, stealing her breath. She staggered back a step, one hand pressed against her heart. Emily gently guided Sophie onward. "You're being very strong, Sophie. What happened after you drank it?" The girl's eyes filled with tears. "I got sleepy. They left me in a room with the door closed. I could hear music and people laughing outside. Sometimes Daddy came to check, but he didn't stay long. I was scared. I held Mr. Whiskers. She lifted her worn stuffed cat for them to see. And I wished Mommy was there. Daniel's jaw tightened. His mind connected the fragments. The powder in Mark's car, the drawing of the house, with the fish mailbox, and now the mention of Samantha Hayes. This wasn't just poor judgment. This was deliberate. Exposure of a child to danger. He scribbled notes, but his eyes stayed on Sophie, letting her know she had his full attention. Rex shifted, letting out a low rumble in his throat. Not a growl, but a sound of solidarity, as though he too understood the gravity of the moment. Sophie reached down, brushing, her fingers over his ears, her trembling ease noticeably. With the dog pressed against her, she found her voice. Steadier. I don't like that house. I don't want to go back. You won't, Daniel said firmly, though he tempered his tone with gentleness. You're safe now. Rex and I will make sure of it. Laura's tears spilled freely. She stepped forward, finally sitting on the edge of the bed and wrapping her arms around her daughter. Sophie melted into her embrace, the sobs she had been holding back, shaking her small body. Laura rocked her, murmuring apologies that tangled with reassurances, while her own heart bled with the knowledge that her trust in Mark, and worse, in Samantha, had placed Sophie in harm's way. Emily gave Daniel a small nod, signaling that the session had given them exactly what they needed. The first concrete testimony pointing toward both Mark and Samantha's complicity. Daniel rose, towering in the fluorescent light, and placed a steady hand on Rex's collar. His voice, quiet but resolute, cut through the heavy silence. These words are enough to move the investigation forward. Now, we make sure no other child goes through what Sophie did. Sophie peeked out from her mother's embrace, her tear-streaked face shining, with fragile hope. Will the bad people go away? She asked. Daniel crouched beside her, his gray eyes softening. That's why we're here, and Rex won't stop until they do. The German Shepherd wagged his tail, leaning closer to nuzzle Sophie's hand. For the first time, since her ordeal began, a faint smile touched her lips. Outside the room, the WT corridor bustled with the muted hum of nurses and orderlies. But inside, the air carried a different weight, the quiet birth of truth, spoken through a child's trembling voice, anchored by the presence of a faithful dog. The gray morning hung over Maplewood like a warning, when Daniel Harris returned with Rex at his side. This time he wasn't alone. 2 patrol cars idled at the curb, their lights silent but menacing. The neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispers rippling through the street. A warrant in his jacket pocket gave Daniel the authority he needed, and the German Shepherd pacing at his side carried an authority of his own. Victor, Hall's house looked different in daylight. The pristine paint couldn't hide the aura of decay that clung to the property. Bottles from the previous night's party littered the porch. The faint sour smell of beer soaked into the wooden boards. The fish-shaped mailbox gleamed blue in the weak light, an absurdly cheerful beacon marking a house, that rier of secrets. Rex's tail stiffened, his nose testing the wind. He gave a low rumble, the kind that vibrated through his chest like a warning drum. Daniel tightened his grip on the leash. Though he knew the dog was not restless, he was focused. Inside, the team spread out. Sergeant Paul Whitaker, with his heavy-set build and weary eyes, barked instructions to the younger officers. His mustache twitched as he muttered about paperwork, but his stance was firm, steadying. Officer Maria Lopez, sharp as ever, with her dark hair pulled into a strict ponytail, documented everything with her camera, moving swiftly from room to room. Daniel let Rex lead. The shepherd prowled through the hallways, nose grazing every corner, ignoring the stale scent of smoke and alcohol that still clung to the air. His ears flicked forward as he reached the back hallway. The same door they had pried open earlier stood, waiting. But now its lock had been changed, a keypad blinking faintly. Looks like he upgraded, Lopez murmured, narrowing her eyes. Daniel motioned for the tech officer, a young man named Kevin Ross. Kevin was thin, almost lanky, with pale skin and glasses that slid down his nose when he worked. He wasn't a man of many words, preferring to let his laptop and toolkit speak for him. His fingers moved quickly over the keypad, testing sequences, while Rex pawed impatiently at the base of the door. Within minutes, a sharp beep sounded and the lock clicked open. The smell hit them instantly. Stale air mixed with something electronic, the faint hum of machinery. Daniel descended. First, Rex at his side, the leash taut. The basement unfolded under their flashlights, not just bottles and cups this time, but evidence of something darker. On one wall, several mounted cameras stared blankly at the room, their red lights blinking like mechanical eyes. A desk against the far wall held rows of USB drives, neatly labeled, stacked in small containers as though someone had been cataloging memories. A large monitor sat in the middle, its screen still glowing with the frozen frame of a paused video. Daniel's gut twisted as the image came into focus. Sophie, sitting on a couch too large for her, clutching her stuffed cat, her eyes wide and fearful under the glare of party lights. Beside her in another clip, a boy appeared. He looked about 8 with messy brown hair and freckles, his expression confused but braver than his years allowed. His name appeared in a labeled folder, Max Thompson. Whitaker swore under his breath. "This is bad. Real bad." Lopez bit down hard on her lip, muttering, "That bastard's been recording everything." Daniel steadied himself, bagging the USBs with gloved hands, marking them carefully. Rex pressed close, the dog's low growl reverberating in the silence, as though he too sensed the violation captured in these devices. The sound of footsteps above pulled them back. Victor Hall, flanked by 2 uniformed officers, was being escorted down, his wrists cuffed, even bound. His arrogance clung to him like cologne. His shirt was unbuttoned, his hair slick, his smirk unshaken. "You people think you're heroes," he sneered. "But you don't even know what game you're playing." Daniel ignored him. His attention was pulled, instead, to the second figure brought in. A woman, her wrists shackled, her fiery, red hair cascading wildly over her shoulders. Samantha Hayes. Her green eyes darted nervously as she was seated in a chair, her once bright face pale, her lips chewed raw. She had always been known as vibrant, witty, the kind of woman who filled a room with energy. But now she looked broken, her confidence drained into a hollow shell. Laura Miller had been called in earlier, and when she stepped into the basement, behind them, her knees nearly buckled at the sight. Samantha, the friend she had trusted, the woman who had babysat Sophie countless nights now, sat in cuffs, eyes downcast. Laura's voice trembled, torn between fury and grief. "How could you? I let you into my home. I trusted you with my daughter. Yay!" Samantha swallowed hard, tears welling at the corners of her eyes. "Laura, I didn't want to hurt her. I swear. Victor, he told me just to give her something to calm her down. She wouldn't stop crying for you, and he didn't want her ruining the night." Daniel's jaw clenched. "So, you drugged a child? That was your solution. I didn't know it would make her sick." Samantha sobbed, shaking her head. "I thought it was harmless. I just wanted to keep her quiet." Rex barked sharply, the sound echoing through the basement like the judgment itself. Samantha flinched, covering her ears as though the truth had teeth. Laura pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely. Her entire body shook as betrayal settled into her bones. Samantha, the woman she once called sister, had chosen convenience over Sophie's safety, feeding her into the maw of Victor Hall's twisted games. Victor laughed suddenly, the sound harsh and grating. "You're all fools. You think locking me up stops this? I'm not the only one." Whitaker slammed him against the wall, fury bright in his eyes. "Shut your mouth, Hall." But the damage was already done. The revelation that Victor's circle was larger than any of Fide, if them wanted to believe, now hung in the air like a storm cloud. Daniel steadied Laura by the shoulders, speaking low. "Don't listen to him. What matters is that Sophie's safe, and now we have enough to bury these people for good." But Laura's eyes stayed locked on Samantha, broken by betrayal deeper than the law could ever punish. Rex nudged, her hand gently, grounding her in the moment. His amber eyes met hers, as if reminding her that even in the ruins of trust, loyalty still existed in fur, in breath, in presence. And though evidence was bagged and prisoners were led away, the weight in the room was not triumph, but heartbreak. The truth had surfaced. Samantha had betrayed her, betrayed Sophie, and Laura Miller. Once so, careful about whom she led into her daughter's life, was left shattered by the knowledge that her greatest enemy had worn the face of a friend. The courthouse stood tall and solemn in downtown Portland, its granite steps washed in the pale glow of morning light. Reporters gathered near the entrance, their cameras poised, their voices buzzing with speculation. It was not every day that the city saw a case this heavy, this sickening. The names, Victor Hall and Samantha Hayes, had already spread through the local news like wildfire, and soon the trial would decide how far justice would reach. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper, ink, and nerves. Wooden pews, creaked as people filled the gallery, their murmurs hushed as the bailiff called order. At the center of it all sat Judge Meredith Collins. She was a woman in her early 60s, tall and slender, with sharp cheekbones and short silver hair that framed a face of authority. Her dark robes hung loosely from her shoulders, but her posture was impeccable, every movement precise. Known for her no-nonsense demeanor, she had built her career on cases involving vulnerable victims. Her piercing blue eyes swept the courtroom like a hawk's, daring anyone to waste her time. Victor Hall entered, flanked by officers, even in handcuffs. His arrogance hadn't faded. He wore a tailored navy suit, the jacket straining slightly at the shoulders of his muscular frame. His slick black hair was combed neatly, and, though his jaw was roughened by stubble, his smirk lingered as though he still controlled the room. Behind him came Samantha Hayes, her red hair loose around her shoulders, no longer styled in vibrant waves, but limp, lifeless. Dressed in a plain beige prison uniform, she looked diminished, eyes rimmed red, her youthful glow gone, and then Mark Miller was escorted in. Sophie's father, once a man who had charmed neighbors with an easy grin, now looked haggarded. His brown hair was unkempt, his once trim frame sagging in his ill-fitted suit. The bags under his eyes told the story of sleepless nights, but his expression carried no remorse, only defiance and shame woven together. Laura Miller sat quietly in the gallery, holding Sophie close on her lap. Laura's blonde hair had been brushed neatly, her tailored navy dress, simple but dignified. The pain in her blue eyes hadn't dulled, but it was tempered with resolve. She had promised herself she would not cry in this courtroom. She would be strong for Sophie, who leaned into her mother's chest, clutching Mr. Whiskers, the stuffed cat. Daniel Harris sat nearby in uniform, Rex curled, obediently at his feet. The German shepherd had been brushed, his coat gleaming, his ears perked as though aware of the solemnity of the place. Daniel himself looked sharp, his gray eyes calm but alert. Today, he was not just a police officer. He was a witness, the man whose testimony would cement the chain of truth. When the trial began, the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney James Porter, rose. Porter was in his 40s, broad-shouldered with sandy hair, combed back, and a jaw made sharp by determination. His reputation was of a man who spoke with both precision and passion. His voice rang clear as he outlined the charges: exploitation, child endangerment, possession of illegal substances, distribution of sedatives. Each word seemed to chip away at Victor and Samantha's thin veneer of composure. The defense tried to soften the blows. Victor's lawyer painted him as a misunderstood businessman, while Samantha's counsel pleaded her client's ignorance, arguing she had only followed instructions under pressure. Mark's lawyer attempted to frame him as a father, misguided rather than malicious, insisting he hadn't known the extent of Victor's activities, but the evidence spoke louder. When Daniel took the stand, his posture was straight, his testimony steady. He recounted the night of Sophie's call, the hospital scene, Rex's alerts, and the discoveries at Victor's home. Every detail was accompanied by photographs, evidence, bags, and the USB drives. At one point, the prosecutor gestured to Rex, seated calmly near the witness stand. This K-9 partner was instrumental in uncovering the evidence. Without his alerts, the basement's locked room and its contents may never have been found. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even Judge Collins allowed a faint nod toward the shepherd, acknowledging the unusual but undeniable heroism of the animal. Most importantly, Sophie did not have to testify. The recordings, the physical evidence, and Samantha's partial confession had spared her from reliving her nightmare before strangers. Laura squeezed Daniel's hand afterward, whispering gratitude for the way he had shielded her daughter from that pain. The verdict came down quickly, a sharp reminder of the consequences that follow betrayal. Victor Hall was sentenced to decades behind bars on multiple charges, the weight of his crimes sinking deep into the courtroom's somber air. But the story didn't end there. Samantha, tearfully standing before the judge, was sentenced for her role in the tragedy. Her betrayal, the deepest cut of all, left her with a future behind bars, her trust lost, and her redemption uncertain. Mark Miller, spared from the worst, still faced the harsh reality of his actions. Convicted of reckless endangerment of a child, his rights to visit Sophie were permanently revoked, and he, too, was sentenced to time in county jail, followed by probation. As the gavel fell, Laura's quiet tears were a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She held Sophie tightly, her arms a shield against the weight of the world that had been pressing down on them for so long. It was not joy she felt, but a deep, unspoken sense of peace, the kind that comes after a storm has finally passed. She kissed the top of Sophie's head, whispering promises of protection she intended to keep with every fiber of her being. Outside the courthouse, the press descended, hungry for a story. But Daniel, with his calm authority, stepped in front of them, blocking their path and guiding Laura and Sophie through the chaos. Rex, ever the guardian, trotted beside Sophie, her small hand clutching his collar as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded amidst the frenzy. Weeks passed, and the world outside their door seemed a little brighter. In a quiet park not far from their home, the first rays of sunlight broke through the horizon, bathing the world in golden hues. The air was filled with the sound of children's laughter and the scent of fresh-cut grass, so different from the sterile sting of hospital disinfectant. Sophie, with her blonde hair catching the sunlight, ran freely across the playground, Mr. Whiskers tucked under her arm. Rex, ever her protector, bounded beside her, his strong frame moving with a grace that spoke of his silent service. Daniel sat on a bench nearby, his uniform traded for the simplicity of jeans and a shirt. His gray eyes, usually so sharp with duty, now softened with something lighter, a quiet joy. Laura sat beside him, her smile faint but genuine. The shadows of betrayal, once so heavy, were finally lifting, allowing space for hope and healing. Sophie stopped running for a moment, bending down to whisper in Rex's ear. Then she stood and turned toward Daniel. Her voice rang out across the grass, clear and full of innocence reclaimed. "Officer Daniel." He stood, hands in his pockets, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yes, kiddo?" Her green eyes shone with a light that hadn't been there before. "Rex saved me, didn't he?" Daniel crouched down to her level, ruffling Rex's fur. "Yes, he did. But don't forget, Sophie, you were the one brave enough to call us. Rex could only help because you found your courage first." Sophie grinned and hugged Rex tightly, her arms wrapped around his neck as the dog's tail wagged, his joyful licks brushing her cheek. The sun rose higher, casting warmth over the park, a new day beginning for them all. For Laura and Sophie, it wasn't just another morning, it was the dawn of a new chapter, a promise that the past would no longer hold them hostage. Safety, peace, and the quiet strength of a family, once broken, now whole again. And for Rex, the faithful German shepherd, it was another day of quiet service, another day of being the silent hero, watching over those he had sworn to protect. Sometimes, miracles don't come with thunder and lightning. Sometimes they arrive in the soft paw of a loyal dog, the trembling courage of a child, or the quiet strength of a mother's embrace. Sophie's story is a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, God places small sparks of light, courage, loyalty, and love that guide us home. We may not face villains like Victor Hall every day, but we all know what it feels like to be afraid, betrayed, or alone. And in those moments, we too can be rescued by faith, by love, by the unseen hand of God working through those around us. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so others can hear stories of love, courage, and redemption. And as you go about your day, may God's grace walk beside you, may His angels guard your steps, and may you find, in every sunrise, a reminder that miracles are still among us.